Welcome back to our program. Today we're looking at a very unique entity. It's called the Pearl Initiative. It was just recently established, basically in September of 2010. And the Pearl Initiative is focusing on promoting sustainable development as well as creating employment opportunities, and directly in some areas and indirectly helping the United Nations accomplish many of the Millennium Development Goals. My guest today is someone who's very knowledgeable of the Pearl Initiative. Mr. Badr Jafar is the Executive Director for the Crescent Petroleum Group of Companies, and he's also the co-founder of the Pearl Initiative. Badr, we're talking about the Pearl Initiative. Let's focus more specifically on four main areas that I know you're looking at, and just give us a little bit of an example, if you would, of each of them, of what you're doing. One, as I looked at your website, leadership training programs. Obviously, training is important. Leadership is important. What are you doing in this area to impart these values and to help train people for the future?
Well, one key area is obviously educating and discussing these issues with our future leaders, business leaders. And so we felt it was very important to align ourselves with some of the work that the universities in the region were doing. We're actually therefore based out of the American University of Sharjah, which is one of the Emirates in the United Arab Emirates. And we're working with them to develop specific leadership programs, not just to educate our existing business leaders, but to make sure that our future generation of business leaders have these principles ingrained into their practices as they go into, the businesses that they're all going to be being involved in. So that's one key area which we're focusing on. Not just the American University of Sharjah, but ultimately also engaging with other universities across the region.
Now, what is one of the main challenges you've encountered as far as working with the leadership training and that type of thing?
I think that what's important to realize, and as I mentioned before, business leaders have to start appreciating and understanding that these practices are not just going to be of good public relations value to them, but that ultimately will achieve to greater profitability. That, I think, is one of the key challenges we're dealing with. It's to educate our business leaders in the region that this will ultimately have a positive impact on their bottom line going forward and will have tremendous value creation going forward. That mode of thinking is something that I think will represent a challenge over the first few years that we get established.
Again, back to the 3 Ps of profits, planet, and people.
Indeed.
Very important. Now, the second item is social entrepreneurship and corporate social responsibility. We've already talked about that to some degree, but how does that tie into what you're doing, and how do you focus on that and impart that information?
The principles of social entrepreneurship are incredibly important, and as I mentioned, we have a good track record of good corporate social responsibility practices. But this goes beyond that, and like I said, really looking into our business models and seeing how that impacts all of our stakeholders and not just our shareholders. Now, through that, you have tremendous impact then reaching across all of the Millennium Development Goals. And I think that each and every industry has its role to play. So the idea is to find the fortes in each of those industries to deal with these specific issues, and working with them inclusively to do that.
And the third area that you're focusing on is active dialogue. What exactly is that?
Ultimately, it's important that everything we're doing is done transparently, openly. Engaging with the media is extremely important as we strive towards achieving these goals. I think that maybe the Middle East, again, has been associated with being a little bit more private. Transparency has been an issue. So it's very open to openly discuss and talk about what we're doing here, and that's really a key part of the active dialogue process.
And a term we hear a lot about lately is governance, and in this case, your fourth area is corporate governance. What is that, and how are you focusing on that?
Corporate governance, in a nutshell, is about intellectual honesty, and it's used as a term which is loosely defined in many different aspects, but in effect it is about intellectual honesty. It's looking within our corporate structures and making sure that we have structures in place that can allow us to deal with our global partners really as we move into an era of greater cooperation. So it deals with issues of transparency, accountability, ultimately has a knock-on effect on issues such as anti-corruption and ethical business. So it's a very key part of what we're doing here.
Now, your goals are very laudable. They're very important. Every business, not only in the Gulf, but around the world, should incorporate them, I would think. But it's always important to determine how well you're doing. Do you have a mechanism in place to determine the effectiveness of how well the companies that are participating in this initiative are doing, or how well the initiative is doing overall?
Yeah, you touched upon a very key aspect of what we're trying to achieve here, and obviously the monitoring process is very important. Because this is a private sector initiative for the private sector, by the private sector, that's exactly the dialogue that we're having with our private sector partners now, trying to figure out a way whereby year on year we can look back and seeing and measuring the progress which we've done. So that system is actually being developed as we speak with our private sector partners, and using some of the key lessons and experience that our global partners have had developing these, such as Transparency International, accountability, the World Bank, and collating those lessons into what we're trying to achieve here.
Now, earlier you mentioned the United Nations Office of Partnerships, UNOPS. That's a key player in this. Are there other UN agencies that are partners that you're going to be working with, or other groups that are going to be very vital to the success of this program?
Indeed, the United Nations is unique in being able to reach across really globally to tackle all of these issues. So through UNOP, we're engaging with UNDP, the UN Global Compact, and a number of other institutions within the United Nations system in furtherance of our goals.
You mentioned the United Nations Global Compact, and this is an organization that is really starting to really take off. I think there are over 7,000 businesses around the world that participate in it, and they, again, have many of the same goals, in fact, all the same goals, I guess, that you do, of accountability, transparency, and they focus on sustainable development. They focus on human rights, laborers' rights, what am I trying to think of as far as the elimination of corruption, anti-corruption, and that type of thing. How do you link with the Global Compact? You're running parallel with it, but is there interaction between the two groups?
Absolutely. It's very complementary, in fact. I mean, the principles that the UN Global Compact promote are very much in line with what we're trying to do here. I guess the difference is that we are a private sector initiative by nature. So I think the UN Global Compact can definitely work with us in the regions to reach out to as many private companies as possible. I believe in the Gulf region today, the UN Global Compact have around 50 to 60 partners, but predominantly in the UAE. What we'd like to see is a lot more in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait, in Qatar, and across the whole region, adopting these principles and reporting back to the UN Global Compact. So there's a lot of synergy in what we're doing, and we do plan on working together to achieve that.
Let's focus on another Millennium Development Goal, Millennium Development Goal number 7, and that's to promote sustainable development. And that's a very broad goal. It can range from reducing or combating climate change to helping to arrest the melting of the glaciers, to reverse desertification that's taking place in many areas of the world. We've seen that it's predicted that we're going to lose a huge number of the biospecies, something like 15,000 are going to be lost in the not too distant future. We've got animals. We have elephants and leopards and koalas and all different types of vegetation that are going to be adversely affected by this. We see that we also included in that, it's not only the animal kingdom, if you will, and the greenery that we all enjoy and it's necessary for life on this planet, but we also see the human element that's brought into it, and how there are problems with certain industries. There are industries that pollute. They have smokestack industries that are quite prevalent. Hopefully we're reducing those in the world today. Humans, there are 6.8 billion people on the earth right now. We all pollute to some degree. We leave our carbon footprint. How can you, to bring your companies together and to focus on these problems, how do you convince them that this, again, I know the profits, planets, and people, but do you find that that's a challenge, or do you find they're very receptive to saying, we realize there are a lot of problems out there, we see the reports that the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has put out, those types of things, but do you see that they come in very readily, or most of them are aware of these problems, or is it hard to convince some, or some of the others may already be on board and are really delighted to try to work on these problems?
I think awareness is something which is generally quite good in the region. Where the challenge is to convince our business leaders that within their businesses, within their specific businesses, they can positively contribute to these goals. Now, to do that, as I mentioned, the profit element is just as important as the planet and the people, because with that you achieve sustainability. It's not just charity. Charity gets you a certain way, and that's excellent. But once those funds or that capital is sort of is departed, it doesn't regenerate. So with the profits element, it can regenerate. So what's key is to work with some of the smaller businesses also to see where in their societies and with their stakeholders how they can also contribute greatly to the planet and the profit side. And that's why we're actually working with some of our global partners who have really pioneered social entrepreneurship to achieve this sustainable development. And I'm very optimistic about that process.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned challenges. Let's take them a little bit broader and talk about maybe the United Arab Emirates or the Gulf states or the Middle East, let's just say in that area, the Arab world. What are some of the major challenges you see as we go into the 21st century? What are some of the ones they're going to be confronting?
I think in the region alone, job creation is extremely important. I believe latest estimates that we need to create over 100 million jobs in the Middle East region over the next 15 years. Now, that really is only ever going to be able to be achieved with the private sector partner, sort of public-private partnership. And that is something which represents a major challenge going forward. Second one is really, and maybe it's a paradox, but is the energy. We're facing, there's an imbalance, even though the Middle East has 40% of the world's reserves, say natural gas reserves, it's still only producing about 12%. And the majority of those reserves are heavily upon some countries, so there is an imbalance. So going forward, globally, we need to create global partnerships to overcome those energy challenges. I believe that with the current estimates on the demand and supply of the oil going forward, we'll have a deficit of about 5 million barrels per day annually going forward over the next 10 years. So that in itself is only going to be able to be met with global partnerships. So that is another challenge in the region.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's extremely important, and it's one that we hope that other areas of the world would look at what you're doing. But Badr Jafar, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you, Bill. Great to be here.
Good
Thank you for having me.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.